Hi, George Haas here. I wanted to continue the conversation around the meditation interventions for the addiction process um, strategies, maybe that's a good way to call them. We've gone over in the last few weeks the first three modules, and really what they're about is emotional regulation. If you look at addiction from the point of view of attachment, what you're really looking at is an emotional regulation strategy that doesn't uh, force you to rely on other people for co-regulation. We're herd animals and evolutionarily adapted to co-regulate with other people. If your experience as a child with your early caregiver was such that the emotional regulation that they offered was unreliable, then you developed a working model of yourself as not capable of getting your needs met, and you developed a working model of the world as not capable of meeting your needs. As you grew up in that family system, often those early experiences are repeated. And when you hit adolescence, there's this awakening where you realize that the caregivers that you had are not reliable and that they can't be counted on. And because of the transition between the child level of thinking and the adolescent level of thinking, we tend, those of us anyway who have issues around addiction, to generalize that to all people are unreliable. And so we begin to develop strategies for emotional regulation that don't force us to rely on other people. We may not understand that this is what we're doing, but largely, somewhere along the line, for most people with addictive issues, a decision has been made that other people cannot be counted on. And so that we look for a way of being in the world that doesn't force us to have to rely on them. If you look at the first module of meditation interventions, craving and urge, we begin to regulate strong emotional events with addictive strategies. And we begin to develop a process of conditioning so that when something happens and the mind needs to regulate, the body-mind needs to regulate, and we've trained it, conditioned it to use some addictive strategy, that's what comes to mind. So craving is this response to the conditions of the present moment that cause us to think of using. If we allow the mind to perseverate or think about, plan, remember when using was good, then we're engaged in a process of self-generated emotion which is meant to be regulating. So we have a normal bandwidth that we can easily manage emotionally. If something happens in the present moment that's within that bandwidth, it just comes and goes. If something happens in the present moment that causes an emotional reaction which is beyond our normal bandwidth, then we have an emotional event that needs to be regulated. And we're conditioned to use a particular strategy to regulate that. If using is the strategy that we've conditioned ourselves to employ, then the mind thinks of using. And then the body-mind engages in the process of thinking about using or planning using. This has an immediate self-soothing effect. So the thought itself, one of the components of it, is going to be an emotional experience. Emotion that's reactive to the present moment plays out on the surface of the body, face, front of the throat, front of the torso, inside of the arms here, and inside of the legs. Self-generated emotion, or emotion that's part of the component of thinking, also plays in the same arena, so that you can displace the discomfort of the present moment through thinking. The second module of meditation interventions is stress, anger, and depression. We are conditioned early in life to use thinking as a way of regulating emotion, and we largely use the strategies that our family system employs. So you'll find that some of the strategies are useful, some of them are not useful. That is to say, some of them generate beneficial emotional experiences which are regulating, and some generate afflictive emotional experience which are also regulating. If you use or allow the mind to think thoughts that generate afflictive emotion for a long period of time, say anger, that something happens in the present moment. Let's say that it's a fear reaction to the conditions of the present moment, and the way that you're conditioned is to use anger as a way of addressing fear. Then the mind will turn on a thought process or a storyline theme that generates anger, and then the experience of anger that's generated by the mind displaces the experience of the present moment. Because the conditions of the present moment are so changeable, the reaction to the present moment tends to come and go quickly. The mind can persist in the generation of anger and obscure the discomfort of the present moment, and then when those conditions change, the mind can shut off the anger. If, however, you allow the mind to generate anger for too long, the biochemical process that's necessary to generate the anger can actually produce a saturation of neurochemicals, which is injurious to the physical structure of the brain. And so the body-mind first shuts down your cognitive ability so that you're unable to think clearly. That is in some sense meant to attenuate your ability to generate an afflictive story. But often the self-generated emotion strategies reside in procedural memory instead of in autobiographical memory, because we've been conditioned to use them, and that doesn't tend to shut off when the cognitive mind is reduced in response to stress. If the mind continues to generate strong afflictive emotion, eventually the body-mind will shut down the limbic system, the emotional center in the brain, and that will put you into a depression. With addiction, it's very typical that people have a cycling depression. You're in difficult emotion, the body-mind drops into depression to recalibrate, rebalance, and then once the body-mind is rebalanced, pops out of the depression. But if the conditions are still causing you to use an afflictive self-generated emotion as a way of regulating that, you'll find that turns back on, the mind is driving that difficult story, and you drop back down into depression as a way of defending against it. That process tends to fill the body with somaticized emotional experiences. This is the third module, persistent negative emotion. The more you use afflictive self-generated emotion as a means of regulating, the more likely it is that you'll store a lot of emotion. We have limits in the body-mind for how intense or how long these difficult emotions can last, and if they become overwhelming, we suppress awareness of them from consciousness and store them in the body for later processing. Now, often in family systems where there's a lot of emotional distress, there isn't the support available to people to process the emotion later, and so it really just stays in the body waiting. The more that we do it, the more energy is stored in the body. So you may be aware of these emotional symptoms, a contractive energy in the body that then releases emotion. We can use self-generated emotion as a means of regulating the often disturbing or difficult experience of so much afflictive emotion stored in the body. It also uses an enormous amount of energy to hold that old emotion, those old unresolved emotional experiences in the body. So what we're really attempting to do is to understand the emotional system that we have, to develop good sensory clarity with it. There are four aspects of the emotional system that we need to have good clarity with. The first is the reaction to the present moment, so the emotional reaction to the present moment, which plays out on the surface, face, front of the throat, front of the torso, inside of the arms, inside of the legs. It's a vibratory energy. The mind is capable of easily recognizing one pattern in the vibration from another, and that's how we know the difference in emotions. Self-generated emotion, so the emotion that's generated by thinking, plays out over the same area. The main way that you distinguish them is that the emotion that's reactive to the present moment tends to flash through whereas the emotion that's self-generated through thinking tends to persist as long as the thought is present. The third type of emotion that you want to have good clarity with is this somaticized emotional energy in the body. We typically know it in the beginning of the exploration as a contractive energy. So once you locate one of these emotional centers, the location tends to be stable. You can easily find it if you come back to it. The contractive energy is PT, a Pali word often translated as rapture, but it's an energetic quality. And then periodically or intermittently there's a release of emotional energy that's detectable. You can have one, my teacher Shinzen Young calls them, using kind of Zen poetry, the pool of poison and pain. I like to talk about the work of releasing these somaticized emotions as pool work. But you can find more than one pool, sometimes, or maybe only one, depending on how you stored them. And then you release them. They tend to go through a series of stages of release. The first is the deeply contractive energy, then it moves into a kind of undulation, like feels almost like the gut is being kneaded like bread might be. Then that opens into an effervescent or kundalini type energy, and then to a rapid expansion and contraction, kind of a vibratory energy. And then you have these big releases of emotional energy. The fourth kind of emotion that you want to have good clarity with is the empathetic experience of other people. So you attune to other people, you allow an empathetic connection to form, and in the compassionate empathy, you have a felt sense of the other person in your body. Empathy is, we talk about in 3 layers. The first is an automatic response to the perception of physical pain, the physical pain of someone else, a kind of whinginess when you experience someone else's physical pain or witness it. The second level of empathy is a kind of cognition, an understanding, a way of reading the other person's external presentation. You're aware of facial expression and body language, and you can understand what their internal emotional condition probably is based on your reading of their external presentation. And then the third level is this compassionate empathy, where you actually connect empathetically to them and feel in your body the emotional experience of the other person. So these 4 areas of emotion we want to be able to explore in our meditation practice and come into a great capacity for equanimity with, so that we can be with them. In terms of developing a strong capacity for emotional regulation, we really want to become brilliant at regulating our own emotion, but at the same time understand that it's perfectly ordinary for us to be unable to rebalance ourselves. The vicissitudes of life easily knock us so far off balance emotionally that we are unable to bring ourselves back into balance. And this is where the co-regulation, emotional co-regulation with someone else comes in. If we have the understanding and we've developed relationships with other people that co-regulate us easily, then it's at those moments when we're so far off balance emotionally that we naturally turn toward other people to help us re-regulate, to help us come back into balance. But when you've had the experience as a child that other people are not reliable and will not help you do this, then you begin to develop strategies for emotional regulation that are both external and don't rely on other people. This is essentially the road into addiction. We're looking for strategies, both substances and processes, that we can use to emotionally regulate when we're so far off balance we can't bring ourselves back into balance. Understanding that the level of pain for people that are in social isolation is extraordinary, and that the level of pain or difficulty of suffering that people who are engaged in productive and meaningful relationships is much, much less. The level of pain that comes from social isolation, from not being willing to develop these kinds of meaningful relationships that are useful for co-regulation, is so extraordinary that we often find that we're needing intense pain-killing substances and processes just to manage that level of pain. That if we could turn toward other people and develop productive relationships that offer us this co-regulation when we need it, the pain of living becomes much, much less. We can all agree, I think, that being strung out is painful. Let's call it this level of pain. If the pain of living is up here, you can see an advantage in using, even though we know largely that it's self-destructive. That level of self-destruction, to get that amount of reduction in the pain that we live with, seems worth it in the moment, even though in the long run it may not be. The pain of using is here, but if you can develop a quality of living where the pain of living is here, using never really looks good. So the way out of addiction to substances or procedures is to develop a way of living, a way of being in the world that is so much less painful than active addiction that it never looks good, and so we never return to it. And we're going to talk next time about the fourth module, which is difficult interpersonal relationships, and I'm going to want to talk about attachment theory, John Bowlby's theory about how conditioning forms the view of ourselves, the working model of ourselves, and the working model of other people, and how in understanding how your conditioning has develop those models, we can see how we can move into a way of being in relationship where the pain of living is so much less than the pain of using that it never really seems like a good option. And this really is the basis of long-term abstinence from both substances and processes. Thank you.